One more point on this, because this past weekend it also happened to be Passover in the Jewish sense. So those that would be ethnically Jewish were celebrating Passover. Don't love it.
Well as, let's be fair here, wasn't just them.
Well,
Also a ton of Christians who are absolutely ridiculous and think that somehow they should
apparently
be
it's a
celebrating this
trend
too.
of them celebrating a Seder
No, it is.
meal.
A Seder meal.
And that's very recent.
Hey, thanks for sharing your opinion. I am one of those ridiculous Christians who celebrates Passover. Every year I have a Passover Seder with my family. And for those of you who don't know, a Seder is just a structured meal that is eaten in a particular order, and the components of the meal tell different aspects of the Exodus story, the story of how God delivered Israel from slavery in Egypt. The Seder is a traditional way that Jews and Christians obey the commandment to memorialize the Exodus story. And for Christians, it is also how we obey Jesus' commandment in Luke 22, verse 19, when he said, "Do this in remembrance of me." In context, Jesus was referring to the Passover meal because that was what they were doing. And so, for Christians, Passover is all about the gospel. Just as God delivered Israel from slavery in Egypt, God delivers us from slavery to sin through the Messiah's work on the cross. And so we observe Passover in remembrance of him. Now, contrary to the claim that Christians celebrating Passover is, quote, very recent, Christians have obeyed Jesus' commandment to celebrate Passover from the very beginning. In 1 Corinthians 5, verse 8, Paul explicitly urged the Jewish and Gentile followers of Jesus in Corinth to, quote, celebrate the festival. Although some people treat this instruction as merely a spiritual metaphor, Paul's use of the term festival suggests that he is referring to the actual festival of Passover, as the scholar J. Brian Tucker writes. Quote, the use of the term festival in verse 8 implies that Paul is referring to a concrete event or celebration, rather than just a metaphorical or symbolic understanding of Passover. If Paul were only using Passover imagery as a rhetorical device, he might have chosen a different term or avoided mentioning a specific festival altogether. The fact that he explicitly mentions a festival suggests that he expects the Corinthian Christ group to engage in a real Passover celebration, even if it is now imbued with new meaning considering Christ's sacrifice. Going into the 2nd century, we see that many of the predominantly Gentile congregations in Asia and Asia Minor celebrated Passover on the 14th of Nisan, the same time that Jews celebrated it, in accordance with the biblical calendar. The Gentile congregations in the West also celebrated Passover. However, around 135 AD, they started keeping it on a different date, the Sunday following the 14th of Nisan. During this time, there was growing conflict between Jews and the Roman Empire, and Gentile Christians faced a lot of pressure to dissociate from Jews. This might explain the alternative date for Passover that emerged around this same time. But in any case, the important point here is that both East and West agreed that Christians should observe Passover. They simply disagreed over when to do it. There's another point that I want to mention here. There is an early Christian by the name of Polycrates. He was a 2nd century bishop in Ephesus, and he talks about how important Passover was to the early Christians. He believed Christians should celebrate Passover on the 14th of Nisan in accordance with the biblical calendar, the same time that Jews celebrate it. In a letter to Victor, a bishop of Rome who supported celebrating Passover on the Sunday following the 14th of Nisan, Polycrates makes a case for his own position. In his letter, Polycrates references Acts 5 verse 29 in relation to the date of Passover. It is better to obey God rather than man. This is significant because it indicates that, for the early Christians, observing Passover was a matter of obedience to God. But wait, there's more. Jesus said that Passover will be celebrated in the kingdom when he returns. So Passover is not irrelevant to Christians. It was very important to Christians in the 1st century and beyond, and it will be important again in the future. So, contrary to Joel Webbon and the other guys in the clip that I played at the beginning of this video, Christians have celebrated Passover from the beginning. We celebrate it in remembrance of the Messiah, per Jesus' commandment in Luke 22 and Paul's commandment in 1 Corinthians 5. And we also will be celebrating with Jesus in the future. So you can call modern Christians who celebrate this festival ridiculous if you want, but we're in good company. Let's continue.
It denies the sufficiency of Christ. It's hedging your bets. That's what the whole book of Hebrews is about. Don't go back. Don't go back. Don't hedge your bets. Don't go back to, in a physical sense, it's like don't go back to the priestly sacrificial system.
So, two things here. First, the notion that you are denying the sufficiency of Christ by celebrating Passover or other biblical festivals, or even by bringing a sacrifice to the temple when the temple stood, that is a misreading of the book of Hebrews. I won't go into detail about how the author of Hebrews actually affirms the ongoing validity of the ritual laws in the Torah, but I recommend these papers for more on that. But secondly, this notion also contradicts the rest of the New Testament. As I mentioned earlier, Paul instructed the Jewish and Gentile believers at Corinth to celebrate the festival. If celebrating the festival denies the sufficiency of Christ, why is Paul instructing his readers to celebrate it? Furthermore, throughout Acts, we see that Paul and the other apostles prioritized Sabbath and festival observance. They weren't denying the sufficiency of Christ by doing so. For more on this, see my published paper, Sabbath Observance in Luke Acts. The apostles also saw no conflict between the gospel and the sacrificial system. In Luke 24, immediately following Jesus' ascension into heaven, the disciples were, quote, continually in the temple blessing God. We should note that this verse comes right after Luke mentions that Jesus opened the minds of his disciples and explained to them how the Hebrew scriptures foretold his suffering and resurrection, which results in the forgiveness of sins. So, at this point, the disciples should have had a very good understanding of the significance of the Messiah's work. If sacrificing at the temple was in conflict with the gospel, then why would the disciples be continually worshiping at the temple? That is not what we would expect if they thought the temple and sacrifices somehow denied the sufficiency of Christ. As we continue in the book of Acts, Luke presents the apostles attending temple services every day. Why would the disciples attend the temple together every day if the rituals performed in the temple were at odds with the gospel they were preaching? Luke also records that Peter and John attended temple services during the hour of prayer. The hour of prayer refers to one of the customary times of corporate prayer at the temple. What's significant here is that these corporate prayer times corresponded to the daily sacrifices. Again, it seems strange that Peter and John would attend corporate prayer at the temple during the exact time when the priests offered the daily sacrifices if they believed that the priesthood and those sacrifices conflicted with the Messiah's work on the cross. Finally, in Acts 21 verses 17 through 26, Paul even joins others in completing a Nazirite vow and participates in public worship at the temple. Luke records that offerings were to be made for Paul and the others, which would have involved animal sacrifices. Later, during his trial before Felix, Paul states that he fully intended to present offerings at the temple. We should note that James explicitly told Paul to go through with these rituals to debunk a false rumor that Paul was teaching believers to abandon the law of Moses. In other words, Paul's participation in the temple service was for the purpose of demonstrating his endorsement of the law of Moses, which of course includes the biblical festivals. So, contrary to Joel Webbon, there is no conflict between the gospel and the ritual laws of the Torah. The apostles and earliest Christians fully affirmed the gospel message while also celebrating the biblical festivals. Let's continue.
You can't celebrate the shadow without rejecting, at least in part, the substance.
Yep.
You can't.
Yep.
To celebrate the shadow, to pay some tribute to the shadow, is to engage in some measure of rejection of the substance. The substance is now here. It would be like a little kid and his dad's on, in the military, he's on deployment and he's got a picture of dad. And for the last 9 months, he's been sleeping with the picture and all this. And then dad actually comes home and walks through the front door and is so excited to see his son, but he's grown so attached to the picture. He's like, Dad, you're distracting me. I'm having, my quality time right now looking at your photo. That would be ridiculous. We would all say, no, the photo was just the type, the shadow, the symbol that points towards the real thing, and the real thing just walked through the door. It is a rejection of Christ, and it is absolutely offensive to Christ, and he will not take that offense lightly.
So again, if you hold this position, you have a big problem, because it means that you are accusing the apostles themselves of rejecting Christ and coming under his judgment, which is absurd. As we've seen, the apostles kept the Sabbath and biblical festivals, and they saw no conflict between those things and the gospel. The apostles understood the gospel better than Joel Webbon does. Second, the analogy that Joel gives is flawed because it sets up a false dichotomy. He is implying that if you value the shadow, in this case the festival of Passover, it inherently means that you are rejecting the substance. But Christians are not replacing Christ with Passover. We're not like the kid in the analogy who says, "No thanks, Dad, I got this picture." No, we celebrate the festivals as an expression of our worship of Christ, who said, "Do this in remembrance of me." Celebrating the biblical festivals is not about rejecting relationship with the Messiah. It's about drawing closer to him through the rituals that he established and fulfilled through his work on the cross. Think about it this way. Baptism, to use Joel's words, is a shadow, the symbol that points toward the real thing. Paul said that baptism points toward Christ's death and resurrection and the new life that we have in him. Since we recognize that reality to which baptism points, does that mean that the physical ritual is now pointless or a rejection of Christ? Are we offending Christ by baptizing new believers? Obviously not. Also, according to Paul, marriage is a shadow, the symbol that points toward the real thing, the relationship between Christ and the church. Since we recognize the real thing that marriage points toward, does that mean that the literal marriage institution that God established is now offensive to him? Again, obviously not. Joel Webbon, your objection to Passover is bad and you should feel bad. Hey, I hope you found this video helpful, and I'll catch you on the flip side. Hey everyone, thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to see more content like this, I want to invite you to subscribe to my channel. Also, don't forget to hit that little bell so that you'll be notified when new videos like this are released. One last thing, be sure to connect with me on my website, davidwilber.com. There, you can find a ton of free resources like articles and videos, learn more about the books that I've written, and subscribe to my newsletter to ensure you never miss an update. Again, thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.